Hi, I'm Cheryl Jackson, and welcome to Your Voice. How many times have your children come home from school and announced they're working on a group project? Sometimes they're happy about that, but often that group work turns into a major source of frustration for the kids and their parents. Your children may not like the kids they're working with, they may feel they're doing all the work, and they may worry about the mark they'll get. Given all of that, why do teachers assign group work? What is the goal? And is there a way to make group work work? We've invited 3 guests to help us understand this classroom practice. Zoe Donahue is a grade 1 teacher at the Institute of Child Study Laboratory School in Toronto. She has taught in both public and independent schools for more than 20 years. Also in studio is Doretta Wilson. She's the Executive Director of the Society for Quality Education, an organization with a mandate to improve student learning in Canada. And via Skype from Hawaii is Spencer Kagan. He's a researcher, presenter, and author of more than 80 books on learning, including Kagan Cooperative Learning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here today. And Spencer, thank you for joining us while on vacation in Hawaii.
My pleasure.
Yeah, so we're not jealous at all, just to let you know. Well, before we get started here, I discovered while I was researching this show that group work is a little more complicated than I first thought. And in fact, group work might not even be the right name for it. So let's define what we're talking about here. Zoe, how would you define group work?
Well, in my classroom, group work would be a time when the children are working either with a partner or in a small group on a task that would follow perhaps a lesson, a discussion. It could be an activity that follows what we've just been talking about as a class, and a time for the children to go off and work together under the supervision of the teacher.
In class?
Yes.
All right. Doretta, when I say group work, what do you think of?
Well, the very same thing, and I'd probably add that a lot of parents have had the experience of the project that gets assigned to the group, and sometimes it's done under the supervision of the teacher, depending on the age of the student, and sometimes it's something that can be done outside of the classroom as a long-term assignment, and it can even mean working on something like producing a play or a larger scale group task.
Okay, Spencer, what do you think of when I say group work?
I think of something that we shouldn't be doing. What happens when we put kids together and tell them to do a project is some will take over and some will take a free ride, and some will get the grade of the work of others. So we've made a very strong distinction between group work and cooperative learning. Cooperative learning is very carefully structured so that each person is accountable for their part of the task and each person is assessed on their contributions, and everyone participates.
Okay.
So for us, group work is wishful thinking. It's putting kids together and hoping it'll work out. Whereas cooperative learning, we take responsibility for carefully structuring so that we get the outcomes that we'd like.
Okay, Spencer, can you give me an example of what cooperative learning looks like then, and how it's different from, group work?
Well, group work, a teacher might say to a pair of students, talk it over, or solve this as a group. Whereas in cooperative learning, we have structures, and an example of a structure might be a rally robin. Let's say that the teacher with young students wants to have them review the characters in a book or the names of colors or whatever. In a rally robin, the students are in pairs, and A says one, then B says one. A says one, then B says one. Whereas with group work, they would say, well, name the colors, and A says one, A says another, A says another, and the other kid says, with their mind somewhere else. So by just simply carefully structuring, we get all the students in the class participating rather than just the high achievers.
Okay.
And one more example, if I can, of a structure to give you an idea. A time pair share. Let's say that the teacher wants the students to give a more in-depth kind of response. what's going to happen next on the story, or why would you explain this outcome in a science project, or so on. In a time pair share, A might share for a minute, B respond with what I found most interesting was, and then B responds for a minute, or shares for a minute, and then A responds. So there's equal participation, and each student in the class is engaged. One of the most important things to note about this, and you began with the question of why do group work, one of the most important things to do is with either a time pair share or a rally robin, in the same amount of time that a teacher could call on and respond to perhaps 3 or 4 students in the class, each giving one answer, the teacher has had every student in the class give several answers. So we get a dramatic increase in participation, liking for class, and retention of content.
Okay, thank you for that, Spencer. Zoe, you work with kids in the classroom. Do you think you need structures like that to make it work?
Well, I think the teacher has a very definite role when children are working in groups. There's a role for the teacher both before, during, and after the children have had this experience. So before they work in groups, we would talk about things like, what is each person's role? What are we expecting you to do during this time? What is the outcome that we're hoping for, so that the children would be very clear about what they're to do and how they're expected to contribute. And then while the children are working, the teacher would be circulating, listening in. If they saw that one child was dominating, they might speak to that child and say, you know, you need to let your partner have a turn to talk. Sometimes children might not be receptive to hearing other people's ideas, so talking about, you need to listen, it's so-and-so's turn to talk, then you'll have a chance to respond. And then afterwards, a chance to debrief, to talk about how did it go, what were some of the problems, what could we do differently next time.
Okay, what are the goals, Zoe, of working in groups then? Given all of that you're going through with the kids, what is the goal in the end?
Well, I think that what Spencer was saying about having children have a chance to participate at a higher level than they would if you were teaching a lesson and calling on children. Also, a diversity of ideas, a chance to solve problems together and to hear the expertise of every child in the class rather than the teacher being the only expert. We found that children are so much more engaged when they're working in a group. Absolutely, there's a place for direct instruction, a time when the teacher is the one who's talking, but as opposed to even a whole class discussion, group work gives so many more children a chance to be heard and to be engaged.
Doretta, do you think it's necessary in a class?
I think it depends on what you're trying to assess, and if the goal is to get kids to participate, to work together, that's fine. But when it's when that is not very expertly done, I should say, sometimes as you were saying, teachers who are experts in doing this, who know how to assign this kind of a project or this kind of work, and know how to properly evaluate what's happening. It's a big difference than if it's just something that's, well, you just want to make sure everybody has a chance at participating. That's a very different thing.
Okay, why does the idea of group work worry you?
Well, I think for the same things that Spencer was saying. I think a lot of the criticisms of it, if it's badly implemented, is one child tends to dominate. Often the brightest, not necessarily the brightest kid, but probably the most dominant personality often does. The real leadership type of child will have a tendency to naturally just take over and just participate a lot more. I think there's a problem with time in the classroom. I think sometimes time is at a premium.
It is these days.
Absolutely, and I think if a lot of time is spent on the learning, the children learning from each other, which I think is kind of a nice thing. However, the teacher is still the expert. The teacher is still the one with the knowledge that is there to impart. And wasting time having kids trying to reinvent the wheel all the time is not particularly productive. I think parents do worry that some kids just aren't naturally demonstrative that way. I mean, I have 3 children, and I can, I'm an expert in my own children, and I could probably tell you for sure that one is very dominant and takes, probably the oldest. The youngest was very quiet, and probably one of the biggest comments all the time were, this child doesn't participate a lot in class. Doesn't mean that child isn't learning, that the information isn't sinking in. They just don't have a character that they like to do that.
So you think some kids just aren't cut out for it? Is that what you're saying?
Some kids just don't like it, and if the goal is to try and get kids to come out of themselves and be a little bit more extrovert, well, that's one thing. That's a different thing that you're assessing. If you're just trying to find out whether they've picked up particular knowledge, well, that's another thing. But if the goal is to get kids to work together and have fun together and feed off of each other and interact with each other, that's a different outcome that you're assessing.
All right, Spencer?
We've been involved in researching the difference between group work and cooperative learning for about 40 years now, and we've looked at over 200 different ways to structure the interaction among students. And let me give a couple more examples of why cooperative learning allows a better assessment. If a teacher in a traditional classroom says, "Who in the class can tell me?" the high achievers raise their hand, and the teacher ends up with an illusion when they get the correct answer that most of the students have the right answer. In fact, it may be very few students. If, on the other hand, you did a rally robin or a kind pair share, and the student and the teacher is circulating, they hear not just from the high, but they hear also from the low and middle achievers, so they get a much more authentic assessment of the classroom. And the students aren't just playing together when they do these structures. They're really working to learn the content. After, for example, some direct instruction, we might do a rally coach. Now, in the rally coach, the students are taking turns. One's doing a problem, and the other is watching and checking and coaching if necessary. And in a traditional classroom, if a student doesn't know, that they're oftentimes too embarrassed to hold up their hand and say, "I don't know how to do this," so they kind of struggle through, and they won't get feedback until the teacher has had time to grade the papers. And oftentimes some of the students might even practice the problems wrong. They can't do that with a rally coach because they get feedback after every problem instead of after waiting until over the weekend when the teachers had time to grade the paper and give them feedback. Now, the empirical research is very clear. We have about 1,000 research studies that have looked at the difference between cooperative learning and traditional classrooms. And if you do true cooperative learning, the results are extremely clear on a lot of dimensions. Not only is overall achievement higher, but the difference between the highs and lows is less. In other words, there's a catch-up effect. You get a closing of the achievement. The other positive outcomes, you get things like liking for school is greater among students, class climate is better, empathy, ethnic relations are improved, self-esteem goes up. And I'm not just making this up. We're talking about years of empirical research which have been analyzed and even done meta-analysis and show dramatic gains among students when they all participate and all help one another.
Okay, thank you, Spencer. Now, we had a little bit of dropout in that Skype feed, and I think, Spencer, you were saying that one of the things that is happens is the achievement gap is narrowed. So we want to hear from some parents right now, though. We did catch up with a mom who had this question about group work.
Hi, my name's Nancy. I'm a mother of 2 children. One's 13 and one is 10. I'd like to ask you about the perils of group work. It inevitably seems like one child does more work than the other when they're doing group work, and I'd like to find out how there are ways to work around that so each kid is working at a fair pace. Thanks.
Okay, I think most parents would have that question. Zoe, how would you handle that?
Well, I think that part of the teacher's role is to make sure that the groups are structured in a way that you have a mix of children who can work well together and that you help them to work well together. So when I'm making up groups in my class, I make different groups for different purposes, and I don't keep the groups together for very long. I would also make sure that I didn't have a child in a group. I might, for example, put all the children who are very quiet in a group together, and then that gives them all a chance to be heard, and maybe put all the leaders in one group and let them
get at each other,
fight it out, and learn what it's like to have someone who's always telling you what to do and wants their ideas to be heard. Now, I'm not saying I would leave them. I would absolutely be there to help them work through it, but I think when you group children in different ways, they have a chance to get to know themselves, and as a teacher, I find I get to know my students so much better when they work in groups, much more so than when I'm just the one talking.
Okay, well that surprises me a little bit. I think your intuition is to put a brighter, maybe louder, more outspoken child with some of the quieter children, but that's exactly what you don't do.
Well, at times.
Oh,
I mix
okay.
them up in different ways. I think
Right.
that children need to learn to work with all sorts of different kinds of people, because that's a life skill. And when they see, gee, I'm the sort of person who always seems to want to be in charge, and maybe I need to hang back a bit, and someone else realizing I'm quiet, but I have something to say, and here's a setting where I feel comfortable doing it. I think the children can get to know themselves, and they can try to work outside of what's comfortable for them, and also get to know their classmates and how they can accommodate and make it more comfortable.
Okay, Spencer, to that end, how do you ensure as a teacher that everybody is participating? I know you have your structures, but how do you make sure that every child is getting their chance?
Well, I think the concern of that parent is very justified. If you and I or any two people are in a conversation, one person can do all the talking while the other person's mind is on something else. And we've all been there. We've all had that experience. The nature of unstructured work is, so that's why we go very much towards structuring their. If that parent had seen a classroom in which, for example, the rally robin's going on, the question is answered. They're taking turns. One shares, the other shares, or a time pair share. One shares for a minute, the other shares for a minute, and there isn't the issue, even the issue of who you have with whom, because the structure carefully makes sure there's equal participation and individual accountability.
Okay. Doretta, one of the major sources of frustration amongst parents, and I know I've had this myself, is having your children think that they're going to be unfairly graded. One child has done more work than the other, or a child hasn't done any work, and how are they assessed? How can children be assessed properly when they're working together?
Well, I think it depends on the task, and I think what Spencer's talking about is a perfect example of effective instruction, of direct instruction with immediate feedback, and that's a key component of ensuring that children learn, because if you don't get that immediate feedback, then as a teacher you don't know whether or not learning has taken place. You can't wait, as Spencer said, over the weekend. You need to know right away to know how to adjust the instruction to ensure that the learning happens. But I think to your comment that your question, I should say, that how do kids know that they're being fairly graded? That again is the key to having a very carefully designed group work or group. And I know maybe that's the wrong term because we're talking about a style of learning. If the instruction is effective and the expertise of the teacher knows how to assess immediately through the skills that they've learned as a teacher, then it shouldn't be an issue. It's when it's a project. And I think most parents, when they think of group work, they think of an assigned project that's done with some kind of supervision of the teacher, but essentially it's a task given to a group of children. Here, you have your little part to do. Maybe it's a specific topic. I don't know, well, let's just pick dinosaurs because that seems to always be popular with younger children. Do a project on dinosaurs. There's a group that's assigned to do this. Somebody does the research. Somebody's supposed to do the writing. Kids, or maybe somebody does the draws, does the illustrations. And I don't know, maybe the other experts can say, is that a very well-designed kind of instruction of group work? That may not be, because that's where the inequities of what each task is assigned it may not be right. However, it may be that some kids take their strengths and use their strengths, because maybe some child is a really good artist, so they like doing the illustration. However, what are you assessing in that assignment? I think that's what needs to be asked.
Okay, Zoe, why do we so often think of group work as as the only way that children work together. And then we run into all these problems. The project.
Yeah, well, I would agree with Doretta on every count. I think that it's important actually not to structure group work that way, that children each have their own little bit to do and they don't get a chance to participate in every part of the work.
Why is it so often that way then? Or is that all that we
yeah.
hear about as parents? Because
Well, maybe-
honestly, that seems to be the extent of it most of the
We probably only
time.
hear the bad things.
I was just gonna say,
we probably
yeah.
just hear the bad things, and those are what kids come home and complain about. If it's working well and it's successful, you don't hear children complaining, you don't hear parents complaining, because obviously the learning is happening.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think again, effective direct instruction with immediate feedback is usually the most successful. And regardless of what kind of structure that takes, what kind of games, what kind of little, I shouldn't say tricks, but little techniques used to do this, it still has to follow that same format.
Okay, Spencer, I think you're with us.
I am with you. We've gone to a cell phone, but
Okay.
I do want to give an example if I can.
Yes, please.
Let's say that the students are going to try to come up with a definition of democracy. In one of our many structures, we would do a team statement. So each student on their own would write their own definition after having studied about democracy and so on. And then they would each read and get feedback from their teammates, their definition, and then they would go to work trying to synthesize, creating a team definition that they could all endorse more fully than the individual definitions. So they have to listen carefully, and they learn from each other, and each person has had a contribution. And when you have that happen, it's quite in contrast to group work, where the high achiever would say, oh, the definition is, and everybody would say, oh, yeah, sure, and take a free ride on that. So we carefully structure, depending on the kind of task, each person's contribution.
Okay, and how is that assessed then, Spencer?
Excuse me, how what?
How is that assessed? How are the children graded when they work like that?
We never grade a group project. We give feedback on the project, and the students can give each other feedback. How well did they work together, and how good was their presentation? How effective was it? But we always grade only on individual contributions. Otherwise, the grade is completely meaningless. If we give a grade on a group project, somebody can take a free ride, not do anything, and if the others have done a good job, they'll get a high grade. So they'll get a high grade for having done nothing. So we simply never do group grades.
Spencer, what are the benefits down the road of students working together, cooperative learning, talking about these things in class? I'm thinking about benefits down the road in terms of their careers, their relationships, higher education.
In the United States today, 75% of all new jobs involve working on a team, at least part of the time. And if we don't have the students working on teams part of the time in our classrooms, they're simply ill-prepared to take their part in the workplace of the future. A computer is so complex, no one person can build it. In fact, no one person can build a component. The workplace, as it's gotten more complex, has gotten more interdependent, and what it amounts to is teams interacting with other teams. So when we're doing these cooperative learning structures, we're really simulating the kind of ways in which students will work together in the future.
Doretta, do you think students can become too dependent on each other when they're working together like this?
No, I don't. I think it still requires individual effort. I mean, that's always going to have to be the major part of how children are learning. I think it's a nice added value to the classroom, and I think it is important for the future. I mean, my own son has long worked in a team atmosphere. That is just the nature of the work that he does. So yeah, it's really important, but the individual's effort is still there.
All right, and Zoe, what do you see as the outcomes of this?
Well, I think that for the children to, as Spencer was saying, to learn how to work together and to be a part of a team and to learn what their contribution can be and how important it is that they do contribute is really important and will be for the rest of their school career and also in their careers. But I think we also, you were asking about can they become too dependent. I think that we also need to give children opportunities to work totally by themselves at school, where they're working alone on something, where they're working with a partner in a small group, where the whole class is working together. We need to let children have many, many different ways to show what they know, because Doretta was saying before that some children are uncomfortable in that small group setting and they may not have a chance to show what they know. So we need to provide lots of different ways, oral, in writing, in conversation with the teacher, so that every child feels that they can contribute.
Okay. Spencer, we're just about out of time, so what would be your best advice to parents when their children talk about group work or cooperative learning?
Well, my best advice actually would be for the teachers of those parents that they learn about ways to structure. We've done a tremendous amount of research. We have ways that work, and just putting kids together and telling them to work together, that's just wishful thinking. So we need to have programs in schools that let teachers know about successful ways to structure group interaction. Okay,
thank you. Doretta, advice to parents?
It would be difficult for a parent to go into a classroom and tell a teacher how to teach. I think that's almost impossible. I think you shouldn't sweat over the odd group project that comes your way unless it's considered a major part of the final mark. But for the most part, it's not the end of the world if they get the odd group project. I think you just have to talk to your kids and find out, well, what are you expected to do? What's your part in this? What's your role in this? And just like you would do any good parent would do, is monitor what's happening in their children's work all the time.
Okay, Zoe?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. And also, we had talked before about maybe children not coming home with the good examples. So when there's a time that's difficult, perhaps saying, well, are there other times you've worked in a group? How has it worked well?
Right.
How have you made it work? What's been difficult for you? And that could be the same when children go out in the workforce, that we would also be saying.
I'm so sorry. We're so out of time. But I wish I could hear the rest of it. Thank you so much. My guests have been Zoe Donahue, Doretta Wilson, and Spencer Kagan. We've got more information on group work. Just go to tvoparents.com, click on Your Voice, and this show topic. I'm Cheryl Jackson. Thanks for watching.